Yeah, the audience won't see that. What else? Yeah,
Just do it.
do what?
He's already live,
He's
isn't
he's
he?
already gone live, hasn't he? He's totally done it to us. That was excellent. That was good job. That was a very good
He's
job.
done
You
it
did that.
every time, but it still gets me every single time.
Yeah.
I mean that. I mean, this is our brand. This is a random conversation. It starts at a random point inside the conversation, right? So
I think
awesome.
this is an. I was gonna say, I think this is also an experiment, right? How many trials does it take until my behavior changes and I learn that this is a true habit and you're gonna do it?
Yeah. Just be smiling the entire time. Just do it. Just
Speaking of changing behaviors, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We have one more guest today that will join us, hopefully at some point. But since this is a random conversation, he will join at a random point in this conversation. So, uh, oh, there he is.
on cue.
Hello, hello. I should have done like this, and then he appeared or something. Anyway, how you doing, Jared?
Doing great. How are you guys?
Good, good. You're a little quiet, so either speak up or increase your volume if you can.
Yeah, let me see what I can do.
Anywho, thanks to everybody for joining us today. We are going to talk about a topic very close to my heart, which is how do you measure your products? So I have with myself my awesome co-host Roxana, as well as Ashley and Jared, who have been part of our ACE community for a very long time, and they run our AI product advisory group that they will tell you about it a little more. But before we jump into it, I would like to ask Ashley and then Jared to introduce yourself very quickly. Tell us what's your story.
Oh, okay. My story.
Okay, give
Well,
them
my
time to
name's
think. So, what are you drinking first?
All right, that's also true.
Water. Water.
Water.
Only water. So my story is I'm consultant by day and a bunch of different things by night. And overall, I have a lot of varied interests that range from AI and cybersecurity to artwork. And I just kind of like touching a lot of different spaces. But for the purposes of my integration with or my work with ACE, I lead the AI Product Advisory Services Group, which is a essentially a volunteer organization that helps people tune and de-risk their AI products. And Jared's been with us for a while now, and maybe I'll just use that as a segue over to you, Jared.
Awesome. I'm going to just silence a couple of things here. Being Slack. Hopefully that'll help with the noise. Let me know how I'm doing right now. I'll try to speak a little bit more, with a higher level of volume for the mic.
Just
But
go
yeah.
2x more than whatever you think is loud.
All right. So yeah, Jared Allen. I am currently on the sales side with a company called Vena, but I actually have a technical and business background in finance and software implementation. So currently working with an organization whose mission it is to help the Office of Finance better plan, forecast, and report, essentially streamline some of these mission critical operations that help businesses to be able to manage their performance, to be able to better strategize. And we're currently incorporating methodology to help organizations have an easy way to apply machine learning and analytics using familiar tools like business intelligence, Power BI, etc. My interest in AI and product stems from really, I connected with the ASIC team last year, got involved in the community. I have a large, pretty big interest in entrepreneurship and also just from my background on the consulting side, solutioning. AI is blowing up. It's being applied everywhere. There's tremendous opportunity and challenges. But I really like to look at things from the lens of the business and from entrepreneurship, which is right in line with the conversation we're having today. So yeah, happy to be a part of this.
Awesome. Roxana, what's new?
Aside from baby, work, and other work, nothing else. But that being said, I have been getting more and more into the whole concept of human-centered data side, which I'm really excited to hear everyone's background on the call because traditionally a product does not necessarily have a machine learning component. So I want, as we go through the conversation, I'm really curious to tease apart, what's the traditional path? What are the additional considerations when you add ML into the mix? But actually, before that, I my experience with clients around the globe has taught me that we always need a little bit of terminological alignment so that we don't talk past each other. So I'm going to throw this question at everyone. What in the world does MVP mean for each of you? And I'm curious if we'll get three different answers.
I'm sure we will. I'll let Ashley start.
Okay. MVP is okay. First, my definition of MVP stands for minimum viable product, or minimum viable product from this way. And what that really means is, what is the simplest thing that you can build to viably prove a hypothesis? Now, your hypothesis may be something like a technical risk. So, is this thing even possible to build? Or it might be associated with business value. Can I actually generate any business value, or is it something that people want to do? So what you typically do is you call something an MVP, which is a way of simply proving a hypothesis, and then you build or deliver that. So that's my definition.
I have a slightly different definition. That's interesting. Roxana, as you said, we already are talking about different things slightly. So what you described, Ashley, to me, or at least I talk about it as a prototype. So you could have a business viability prototype, you could have a desirability prototype, and you could have a feasibility prototype. Like, all of these are different. But once you bring in all of these together in one solution that has all the three aspects of desirability, feasibility, and viability, then you have an MVP. Before that, if you have only one component in your hypothesis testing, so essentially, yes, using a prototype, you're validating separate hypotheses, but then with an MVP, you're testing the hypothesis with all three of these work together. Like,
I,
that's what I define an MVP.
I like the way you extended that,
All
because
right.
you do need a minimum amount of each of the ingredients,
Right.
a minimum amount of each of the ingredients, but usually you're focusing on one. And a little while ago, I was on Hacker News, and people were talking about like really good heuristics for product development. And one of the ones that I really, really like is that you either take a business risk or a technology risk. Avoid taking both at the same time.
Yes.
And that's been instructive in a lot of areas of my life, but that's kind of where I was going with it. Is you typically are trying to prove a single hypothesis area of sorts uh, with your MVP. But I like the way you said there is you need a minimal amount of each to make it something that you can actually deliver any kind of value from.
Yeah, definitely. I think we are both looking at it from a slightly different points of view, but you need a minimum amount of each. But definitely, in a lot of cases, one of them is a much more significant risk, while you're trying to do relatively more known things on the other two dimensions, for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think my definition will be again a slight variation of that. Ashley's was very scientific. I think Amir was, on that continuum a little bit less scientific. Mine, looking at the lens from the business perspective, most people when they think of an MVP, they're saying it within the context of getting a product to market. And when you're trying to bring a product to market, you're trying to do a couple of things, right? You're trying to address a problem that people care about, right? And then at the same time, if you're showing someone an MVP in the form of a demonstration, what you're trying to do is prove that this particular product is addressing that need in a desirable way, right? So it's not completely divergent from what they just mentioned, but I just wanted to add that additional perspective. And I think the end user is someone important to keep in mind. This could be a company that you're trying to onboard as your first, fifth, 10th customer. It could be an angel investor, right? The MVP, it's all about, yes, you don't want to take too many risks, business and technical, right? And part of that is because of you want what you are trying to do to be achievable. And again, when you think about speed to market, you want to be able to get to the solution as quickly as possible because we live in a hyper competitive era right now. Regardless of how great you think your idea is, there's someone else in the world that probably has the same thing that's trying to address the same problem. And if not, it's just a matter of time. So you want to de-risk bringing a product to market by really honing in on what is the problem, what is the quickest path to solving it, and how do I elegantly show my product's ability to solve that challenge in a way that is going to resonate with my audience.
I like all of the definitions, and I think they all resonate with me to a certain degree. I think I think of it a lot simpler. Maybe I think of it as a proof of concept, and then what is it that I'm trying to provide evidence for? Because one of the questions that I found, or one of the points of disagreements between um, teams that I found when it comes to MVP is exactly, Jared, you already brought it up. Is it pre-market or post-market launch? And what do you measure, what the definition is of an MVP, whether you're thinking post market or pre? To me, it has very different consideration and implications. If I'm pre market, I'm focused on usability, I'm focused on showing that it exists, it lives, it can be used. Post market, then I'm already thinking of that business aspect of it. But we did have a really fifth option in the in the chat. Most valuable person on the team. So that one made my day. Thank you, John.
There you go. Yeah, that's definitely many interesting ways to look at, you know, what needs to be minimally present for something that can be called a product. So I guess for the purposes of today, we can spend a lot of time talking about any of the three dimensions that we mentioned, like the feasibility, viability, and usability. But sorry, and desirability. But I think one of the interesting things that we want to focus the session today is around usability. So assuming that what you're building is viable, assuming that it is feasible to some extent, and assuming that people actually care about it, like it is desirable, but it needs to be usable too. Like if you have all the above, of course, usability is going to affect all the above, but if that's not present, then you end up with something that is great, but nobody understands what's happening in it. So what are some of the ways that you ensure usability as you're designing your product early on, and how do you go about testing that in the earlier stages of design, essentially?
You know what? I'm going to take you one back because
Okay.
once again, I'm going to put my questioning hat on. What do you mean by usability? Because again, most often than not, I've heard people focus on two out of the three official aspects. So I'm curious what it means to everyone.
Okay. Who wants to go first?
I can tell you the official, like the what's it called, international standard. What is it called? ISO.
Okay.
What's the O
ISO
for?
standard. Let's start
Yes,
Standard.
with I wouldn't want to bias our perspectives on this because I think this is usability is something that's so personal to users, and if we're really looking at, and we should be looking at, product design from a user perspective, um, I think all of our opinions matter, and then we'll kind of see how that compares. For me, when I think about usability, there's a couple of different things I think about, right? So, like as a user, how intuitive is this to me? How quickly and does it do the design elements flow in a way that makes sense for me? And it might not even be something that is like a conscious thing. It could be very much subconscious. We're all interfacing with different products all the time, and throughout both the digital world and the physical world. But there are common standards and things that we know that are just best practices based on our understanding of the world around us, in what makes sense and how our brains function. Right. So if, as a user, does this make sense? Can I navigate it, or is it taking me a long time to figure it out? That would be intuitiveness for me. I think it is important to highlight accessibility, something that's often overlooked. I'm pretty sure the ISO standard probably touches on that as well, right? But understanding that we're all coming into interacting with a thing with different capabilities, I think that's an important consideration, right? So how much of the population is able to make use of this, own it, adopt it? Um, that's integral to the conversation.
Maybe I'll take a step back because I think what you described is definitely great, but I think on a more abstract level, I think the answer of what is usability really depends on the product and its go-to-market strategy, right? If it is, for example, a product with a go-to-market strategy that is product-led, like a freemium model, then the usability is very important in a sense that is it a self-serve product that people understand what is happening, then they can follow the process you designed for them, versus a product that is the go to market strategy of it is sales based. There's a customer success person that is going to sit down and handhold you through a bunch of processes and teach you how to do stuff, and other go to market strategies as well. So I think answering that question in the absence of this context is going to be very difficult because it has to be usable for a particular subset of users in a very specific way that the product is going to approach them.
And can I extend your definition just
Please do.
slightly? Maybe even make it a little bit more abstract. If we think about usability as a definition of, how effectively does the given product meet the expectations of it? Okay, like, is it good at meeting the expectations? Well, that definitely is informed by what you're saying, which is go to market. Like, what is the form of the product? Is it an API? Does it produce predictions that way, or is it some kind of magical thing that it doesn't even exist, but it changes your life? So, like, how effectively that system or that whatever product is delivering on its expectations is a driver of its usability, or like that would be, call it, my way of thinking about it. Now, sometimes your usability is informed by how far along on the product adoption curve you are. Because, Amir, would you consider yourself an early adopter?
Of
Would you just say that, like, let's just say that it's a new thing. Would you be earlier on the adoption curve or later on the adoption curve for an average product? I'm gonna just guess, and I'm just gonna assume that you will be. Okay.
Sure, let's go.
Therefore, you're usually willing to accept a bit of a hackier experience, right? This thing isn't really great at meeting the goal, meeting my expectations, but at least it's meeting them. Whereas when you're farther along and you're into early majority or into the laggard stage, this thing had better be polished. This thing had better work. It better have a support model. It better have a whole bunch of other trappings associated with it that make it acceptable, that make it usable. So, um, yeah, I guess just to summarize, the form of it definitely has an impact, and then how far along in the adoption curve would also have a very big impact on usability.
That's actually
Yeah.
very interesting. And I really wanted to have a disclaimer, and I forgot to say at the beginning that I might change my opinion. Wish I had said that. But I would probably incorporate some of those aspects that Amir and Ashley covered as well. And it's interesting that, again, when we're trying to define what usability means, we're not able to divorce any definition from the people who are going to be using whatever it is, right? So like it's just an interesting theme to keep in mind as we continue this conversation. And also want to point out that as we go through a product maturity adoption curve, companies are always trying to figure out their product market fit. I would say someone like Amir is most likely not the person that any company is aiming to serve right out of the gate. I doubt that there's any technical challenge that Amir could not meet. But ultimately, I mean, given that it is possible, but for the average consumer, that's who they're trying to solve for, right? So I think just thinking of, where we are going to focus our emphasis and our point of conversation on the curve, probably not the right at the beginning, maybe, right? But I'd venture the guess it would be a little bit further along.
So
Yes.
is it fair to summarize what is said so far to say that MVP is really focusing on what is it that we are building, and the conversation around usability is essentially how is this delivered to the user? Is that
I don't think it's as easy as that.
okay?
Okay. I do think that there is a bit of why to be baked into that.
Okay.
Okay.
I
So
was thinking that why straddles both sides really.
it does. Like the Venn diagram goes like why
Right.
and what would be MVP.
Hmm.
And then usability is like another part of the Venn diagram, which is the
Right.
how part. And I think that, you would see all three of those to come together. And, just to kind of think about the magical moment is like right in the middle is like where you've really matched the why, the what, and the how. Huge win. Huge win. Big
Right.
innovation. Many, many, many successes.
Yeah.
The first thought I was thinking of once we started talking, yeah, it's kind of the definition of it to me, because you brought it back to the user. I remember teaching it and a student pointing it out to me. It's like, is that bad English? You have like the word specific in the same sentence. It's like, yes, because it really is about specific use, specific context, specific users. And I don't remember what the other two were. And then the other part, I love how you said the Venn diagram, Ashley, and with the how, I would also add the how well, because we talked about the efficiency and a bit about the effectiveness, but really to me it's also the satisfaction of the user, because in a highly competitive market where there's like 20 products offering the same thing, the satisfaction can go beyond what I would say is traditional usability flaws.
That's a very fair point. As a market commoditizes and as you get more players and entrants, MVP looks different because you have to tune for desirability a lot. You have to tune for actually getting people to want to use it and switch their behavior. So, like, I'm sure the first person through the gate has educated the market and helped people kind of learn what this thing's all about. The next couple of people through the gate are kind of differentiating themselves versus that person. So therefore, the floor of what's an acceptable product has raised because all of a sudden now I have to bundle in a bit more of the call it the anchor behavior into my product that is already existing, that is expectation, and then I have to kind of go a little bit farther, which I think has really complicated a lot of products. So it's really hard to do the Craigslist view of anything because people go, "What is that? I don't get it." Right? And the reason why I'm calling it the Craigslist view is the Craigslist still looks like a site from the late 90s. There aren't any late 90s sites anymore. That just doesn't happen. You can't get away with that. You have to build a lot more interfacey stuff, experiencey stuff, and therefore your MVP needs to shift as well. So the how well, yeah, the bar is slowly creeping up. Ideally, you've been able to kind of see a new angle, and therefore you can add a little bit more hackery. But if you're just inserting a new product into the market, the bar is definitely raising over time.
There's one word that you said that really piqued my interest, and I am a big fan of that being part of it, which is desirability. But how do you quantify that? How do you measure desirability? That's a less, it's a bit of a less tangible one, right? Or at least in my.
I can get started. So, well, can I actually address two questions from the chat very quickly before we go there? Because, I want us to talk about them before we move on to a different topic. Uh, one is Yenny. I'm hoping that I'm pronouncing the name right. Is asking, why do you even care about these definitions? Like, do you and your team have to care about this, right? And I think the answer to that is that yes, because otherwise you're chasing different dreams. Like, I'm trying to build this thing while my teammate is trying to do this other thing. We are trying to build an MVP that has overlap of a lot of factors, while a teammate might be chasing just writing code in Jupyter Notebook and hoping that that's the product, right? So being on the same page and remaining on the same page is extremely important. It's something that we are learning every day in my company, that we get on the same page 2 months later, everybody's moving in a different direction, and we're like, wait a minute, why are you doing this? And then we realize that, oh, okay, our definitions shifted, right? So that's extremely important. And not only being on the same page at the beginning, but remaining on the same page about these definitions. And the second question is, uh, on the topic of adoption, John is saying that, especially in legacy systems, he hears a lot about how, users don't want to change their behaviors and adoption is going to be hard and blah, 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 as an excuse for people not to change what they're using, uh, which I see his point of view. But at the same time, it is extremely important. It's very, very difficult to change people's behavior. They could be doing things with square wheels, but it is working for them. And it is very hard to convince them that it is not very efficient, unless you take very deliberate effort in designing the experience in a way that is transitional and forms the new habit. I don't know how do you all think about that?
On the topic of behavior change.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the model, or at least the heuristic or the idea that I always go back to when I think about behavior change, is actually BJ Fogg's behavior change model of like motivation versus ability, where if you have really, really, really high motivation to do something, you don't need that much ability, or you need less. But on the other side of the graph, it's like if you don't have very much motivation, you need lots of ability. And therefore, like think about the person in the legacy environment, and I've got to switch over an entire system. Do I have much motivation? Maybe not. Maybe not. Like, don't broke it. So don't fix it if it's not broken. Kind of approach to things. The other thing is like, is the cost of the change greater than the value returned from it? And like, what's my confidence associated with that? Like, when I always think about these things, I'm always trying to contextualize it in at least those two dimensions. And the only way for you as a new product person to come in and disrupt a legacy environment is usually, I hate to say it this way, is usually to flip the table. You're typically going to have to go at the problem in a completely different angle. Otherwise, you will always come up against the change friction that will prevent you from getting enough traction to really prove that you've got a really good business opportunity. So it it's usually incremental wins, making things a little bit better for that legacy system, or not evolution. This is revolution. We're going in a different direction altogether.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking of the kind of a similar example. So let's say you have something 20 years old system, hasn't changed at all in the past 20 years, but it has those legacy clients that have memorized every pitfall and have perfect workarounds. And now you're trying to bring in new clients with today's expectations, would never ever spend a cent or a minute on the product in the current condition, but any change would disappoint your existing ones because they've spent literally half of their life memorizing every workaround around it. So I I think that's an interesting case, because if you fully turn or flip the table, like you said, what happens to the existing customers? Can you keep them on? And if you do some form of transition, having them in parallel, like that can get very costly very quickly.
Yeah, and I think going back to what Ashley said is a good transition, and what you said, Roxana, is a good transition to the question you asked earlier, because motivation is a big part of the question, right? In any behavior change, what are the incentives for the behavior? And the question of why in the product design is a very important component of what we're talking about. And John in the chat is asking if focusing on a very specific user for an MVP is an important thing. And of course, because otherwise you have no idea what you're building and for who. So really understanding who you're building for and what their incentives are extremely important. And that's where the topic of desirability comes in, right? So you have to find a group of people, a subsegment of population that really cares about something that you're doing. So how do you measure that? In my experience, you just go out and talk to them a lot, every day, several times a day. I don't know if there are better ways to do it. I'm sure there are, but understanding if something is desirable, because a lot of the time as product people, we also might fall into this trap of, oh, I'm the user of this experience, I know exactly what is needed. Of course you do, but really, are you actually building something that everybody else is experiencing a pain point with? uh, and honestly, I don't know how else to measure it other than just very qualitatively through a lot of user interviews.
I think it depends on the product. So, like, if you get, I think you said this, but like, I think it's a question to indicate desirability is like, how do you know someone wants it, right? How do you know that somebody wants it? They are indicating their desire. They're acting on their desire. So when you're talking to somebody, I think what you're doing is you're trying to figure out like what would make this more desirable. I got something. What do I got to do to improve my value proposition for you to make it more desirable to you? But that is a means to an end, which is like, do it. Are you going to buy the shoes? Are you going to buy the food? Are you going to log into my site? Like until you see that moment, you don't know if you have desirability. You just maybe kind of throwing ideas at people, but they have to actually do something, and that's hard. And like the intelligentsia in the product world will probably tell you what's the leading indicator of that, and they try and go upstream as far as they possibly can, and then they funnel you in. But like until you see that moment where bang, they did it.
Mhm. Would you guys agree that it is easier to determine or measure desirability with the B2C product, consumer app, as opposed to an enterprise or B2B app? Curious to get your opinions.
I think we need to sit on this for a minute. I think
I
each
have
of
a
them,
night.
yeah, I think each of
Go.
them have their own complexities. Like I think just saying easier is simplifying what they are significantly, because they are each very complex in different ways. And generally, the way you approach taking these products to market really depends on who you're interacting with and what techniques you're using. So yeah, I mean, it is, consumers have many options. So
Mm-hmm.
getting their attention is generally very, very difficult. So at least from where I'm standing, like, and we are building a product that is both consumer and enterprise facing. So we are seeing the challenges on both sides, right? So and neither side is easy. Both sides have a lot of options, and just interacting with them, going to market with them has many, many nuances on both sides. So yeah, I'm curious why you're thinking that way. That's very interesting.
Yeah. So the reason why I ask is I don't know if this is the right answer, but if someone put a gun to my head, I would say business to consumer would be easier. I understand some of the challenges, but having sold into the enterprise space before product led growth became a thing, the main way that you would, as a company, measure desirability, let's be honest, is with currency. Currency is the measure of value in a business context. And getting someone to ultimately change their behavior in a business context, an enterprise context, means ultimately an investment, signing up, committing money, committing constrained resources, limited resources. And when you are trying to sell into a company, there isn't just one person that has to make that decision. It's usually a buying committee. It's a group of people, which brings an extreme amount of complexity in being able to both uh, increase adoption of your product and scale, because there's so many things you have to solve for there, including having to address potentially multiple personas within a particular market segment. Whereas with the consumer, it's it's one person. Yes, everyone's distracted. It's hard to get people's attention. People have limited bandwidth. But at the end of the day, for me to, especially when it comes to consumers, I think it's easier to start with a product that's free, although companies are increasingly solving for this. So that becomes less of a barrier, but I think it's still less of a barrier on the consumer side. So then now, money aside, we're able to put a box around what we're defining as success when it comes to desirability, which is our metrics, right?
I thought of it was in a kind of similar way. So I'm really glad you brought up personas. So I thought of it, if it's a business to consumer and I truly know my consumers, then I can have personas that represent my consumers. If it's a business to business, chances are whoever, if a business buys a product, whoever has the buying power is not necessarily the user of that product. So I have, on top of having a bunch of personas, I actually have market personas and I have user personas, and those two are very different from each other. And just because my market persona say this rocks doesn't mean there'll be adoption within the company by the user personas. So that's where I went with this.
Absolutely.
I there's an interesting question in the chat. I want to bring that up very quickly, uh, which is how many features do you need for something to be an MVP? Uh, I mean, that's not literally what the question is asking, but I'm just rephrasing it to make it a little more funny. Um, so that's a very interesting question because I think if the extent of features that you're developing, well, I guess that's my question too. Like, if the number of features that you're developing is the criteria for you to get closer to the desirability, are you moving in the right direction? And going back to what Ashley was saying, that there is something, I'm going to fine tune it so that it is, usable, desirable, etc. But you could be fine tuning around a completely local minimum that is very, very far from where you need to be. Like, we have made this mistake in our product so much. Like, before, we were building something, people were not using it. We started doing, oh, maybe our onboarding should, maybe we should create videos, maybe we should do documentation, adding more bells and whistles and features, while the fundamental problem was that we were building the wrong thing. Right? If you, in my opinion, it may be a bit cynical, but in my opinion, if you're building the right thing, one feature is enough, because that feature is the killer feature. That's the differentiator versus everything else. So if you are in a mindset of, oh, I need to build yet this other feature to make this desirable and usable, I think it's a good moment to take a step back and think, am I right? Am I building the right thing? The answer might be yes, but you have to take that a step back and think about it.
Definitely. And there's a really good line that the product manager's job is to maximize the amount of work not done. So like, it shouldn't be like about how many lines of code or how many features. It's like, how many things do I not have to build to get that thing to make it, actually adopted. And a really good, I think it's in the B2B space, sorry, B2B, B2C space a little bit better. It matches a little bit more. A really, really good like heuristic is like, think about like a funnel as you move from like awareness to acquisition to actually use of your product. And Dave McClure's pirate metrics are a really good way of measuring this. But if you just Google Reforge uh, user acquisition or something like that, you're going to find a really, really good way of saying, okay, I had this many people come to the site, I had this many people log in, I had this many people do another intermediate step of creating a profile. But then, did they have the critical moment? Did they have that critical experience with my application that indicates desirability, indicates some form of like activation? And are they in or not? Which I think would also indicate a certain amount of desirability.
So I
Can
want to
I
pivot.
bring up?
Oh
Can I
yeah,
bring
go
up
on.
the stupidest example I can think of that actually changed my working at a desk? So
Please
my
do.
dad gives very creative gifts, very simple but very effective. One of my favorite ones was a cup, like any other cup, except it had the suction mechanism so it wouldn't spill when it's next to your laptop. And I have spilled Viet coffee with condensed milk and sugar in it several times. So it had one feature. I had to really smack it for it to spill. And obviously, I wouldn't do that. So to me, that one feature is it made for one of the best gifts ever.
So, yeah, that's a very good example. And I think the conversation about that unique feature, right, is very related to the same question that am I building the right thing, which normally the right answer to it is, well, you should measure it. There should be metrics that tell you how close or far you are from where you're trying to be, where the user expectation lies, and all that. So I think how you the effectiveness of this cop is how many times am I you know dropping coffee on my laptop or something like that. So in other examples, there are other metrics we look at. There are, of course, the whole conversation around vanity metrics versus actually impactful metrics. So what are our thoughts around that? How do you think about a quantitative measure of how close you are to where you need to be, and what are some of the techniques that can be used? We talked about how you would do that qualitatively to some extent, but I think we should move on to a more quantitative conversation. How do you measure it?
Are you talking about how do I measure continued engagement or initial engagement?
Well, start from one, move to the other.
Okay. So in your initial engagement, it's likely you have to identify what I think it's Reforge calls the aha moment of them using the app or using the product or engaging with your value proposition. And like, it's a good thing to know how many people did I have to try and convince to do this in whatever way I did user acquisition. How many people did I have to put this in front of before I had a positive use of the aha moment? And then over time, hopefully you can drive more traffic and get more people to see it. And then you get some degree of statistical significance of I have to show it to 100 people and I get 3. Great. Great. Honestly, like the more discipline you can put around that, the less heartache later on. And I also think that it allows you to remove a lot of bias from your product decisions because you don't get wedded to your idea when it's not working because it's the math is the math. Now, obviously, I get it. But then beyond that, like you're not just looking at like people's engagement with that aha moment of sorts. It's like, are they sticking around? Are they re-engaging? Are they actually continuing to experience the value? Because that I think indicates whether your product has any legs. Is it going to stick at all? Like if you're going to get people to have that one moment and then, man, I have to do that again. I got to do it again. I got to do it again. That's when I think you're onto something, and then tune as required, and you'll see the change in the numbers. That was it. Over to you.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that aha moment or quick win. And the more, I don't know what to call those spaces, that the more regulatory or stricter they are, the longer the onboarding before you get to it. And I think that's something that I see a failure point in many apps and products. Collect a ton of personal information, and only after I can actually experience that aha moment or quick win. So then the drop off happens before actually getting to experience it because there's too much friction before that.
It's interesting. When we talk about measuring customer acquisition, we could also look at it from a couple of different mediums, and it definitely impacts how you're able to measure and what you're looking for, right? So in like the B2B space, the first thing that people tend to look for, I know this for a fact, but it's also backed by research, is it's very difficult for salespeople to sell in to companies now. People won't want to do research. They feel more empowered to do their own research about a product before being willing to converse with anybody. So the first thing they're going to go to is your website, right? And website traffic, it's a very challenging game because only 2 to 4. I think the stat is 2 to 4% of website visitors ultimately sign up for your website. That's a very small percentage. And then when you think about this as a signal of desirability, there's also kind of two components to it, from what I can tell, right? Am I solving the right problem? And a lot of your thinking around that goes into things like, hey, like, what's the total addressable market for this problem? How many people have this? How big of a pain is it? What are the consequences of not solving it? But then it's also, how do I communicate to people that I'm solving this problem? And that in itself is a huge challenge. You could have a great product and solve the right problem, and people struggle all the time with how to communicate that. Branding, and then also the customer experience from the moment that they engage with your website. Those are all things that can determine, customer acquisition.
So as I listened to the answers, I realized that my question was a little underdefined because, obviously, when we are talking about users and measuring their behavior as they interact with a product, they go through a life cycle. There are steps of acquisition, as many of us focused on, then the steps of engagement, and the steps of retention. So, and a lot of the time, it is very difficult to focus on all of them because you most probably have a small team with zillion things to do. So you have to figure out which one is the most important metric. So the so-called North Star metric that you want to focus on, and then how all the other metrics funnel into that. Uh, and and of course, a lot of the time, that actual metric that you're interested in is not even possible to measure because you don't have enough traffic to even get to that in a meaningful way. So a lot of the time, you have to think about the leading indicators of that metric and how they lead into it, blah blah blah, until you get enough usage that you have the statistical significance to even be able to talk about, okay, this is a metric, we're measuring it with this accuracy, blah blah blah. And we have gone through figuring this out for the longest time, and we tried so many different metrics. But what I really liked about what Ashley said is the stickiness of the product. You could bring in millions of people a week, but if no one stays around and comes back next week, nothing matters. You don't have a product. You just have a marketing hype. You're a great marketer, great for you, but you don't have a product. So, in my opinion, the most important product metric in early days is retention. You do not need to worry about acquisition. You do not need to worry about engagement too much. If your retention is not high enough, you don't have a product. And if you don't have that, there's no need to optimize anything else because you don't have a product.
Can I expand a bit on what you said there? I
Please
think
do.
retention is one part of the formula. I'm sure. Well, I don't know if everybody has heard of something called CAC to LTV, customer acquisition cost to lifetime value. Like your retention will drive your lifetime value, which will be your denominator, but your numerator is actually a reflection of your economics of your acquisition machine. And like it's really hard to build long term with a really bad CAC to LTV ratio. And it back when I was working with AdVol and we were trying to get it out, we had to look at that number a lot, and we had to essentially meet up to other people's standards. So there are like industry ratios that they expect to get funding, and I don't know what they are now, but like it was at least 3.5, and I bet the number's higher, but I think it was at least 3.5 that like you could only spend like, what am I trying to say here? No, your value that the customer would generate would had to be at least 3.5 times what it costs to acquire them, which was like, ooh, right? Like we had to figure out a way to get them to stick around for long enough that they paid themselves back like by like 4x, and like that I think was the trend that the investors were looking for. They were looking for you to maintain that while you were growing and scaling your operations and whatnot. So uh, that's just like the extension on the retention side. The economics also matter.
100%. I still argue that LTV is more important than CAC. They're both very important, 100%. Like for the long term growth of the product,
Hmm.
that ratio is extremely important because that's the unit economy of your platform. But my argument is that you can focus on one thing at a time. Focus on LTV first. Once you have that, then go after the CAC. Of course, if you have no idea how the CAC will be fixed later, you're in trouble. 100%. You're absolutely right.
And
But
sometimes investors are willing to give you a bit of a pass on
right,
that because they see
exactly.
vision, right? So like
Right,
look at Uber. Uber
right.
was like negative like lifetime value for a very, very long time. So they're
100%.
subsidizing everybody. But by developing such a massive, group of people that were stuck, now we can market other things, Uber Eats and all the other Uber things. But like you gotta have something pretty disruptive to get that kind of a pass.
That's right. Right. So that's exactly what I mean. Like usually you make an argument for this is my plan to fix CAC later while I'm focusing on LTV for now, right? So 100%. I want to switch the conversation though to we were supposed to talk about machine learning a bit and product analytics. So a lot of the stages of the life cycle that the user goes through the platform is the acquisition, engagement, attrition, etc. Uh, and we have very good tools these days to measure like very accurate event level behavior of the user. Like the user scrolled to this part of the page and clicked on this and then clicked on that and then on this and etc etc, right? Like we can get very very detailed user behavior. There are many tools. We use Mixpanel. There are many other ones, Amplitude, etc, segment to get from different platforms, etc. So you can have a very comprehensive view of essentially what the user is doing in your platform, early days, later days, whenever. Like essentially depending on the maturity of the product, you have some volume of data that is coming to your database. And a lot of time as machine learning people, we love using machine learning to analyze that and do things, make product decisions is what I mean by do things. Yes or no? Where are we on this?
So, with my limited amount of research I've been able to do so far, I was actually surprised to learn. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised, because AI adoption is extremely hard to operationalize in a product. But the most popular product analytics offerings that are out there, I haven't really spoken or found one person who's been able to tell me that they have some useful predictive analytics that's reliably built into the platform. People are still building out a separate database to store all their event level information, the user attributes and what have you, in order to do this analysis separately apart from it. I think there is a tremendous amount that you can do with machine learning in order to drive user adoption. And I think the thing that comes to mind as the most obvious, I don't know if it's the most obvious, but being able to, like, recommender systems, I think are extremely useful, both as a team looking to get suggestions as to what to do next, whether it's from a product perspective or from user experience perspective, but also from the actual user engaging your product. If you can build that into your product, I think you have a lot higher likelihood of being able to drive the correct behavior and also point them in the right direction so that they're getting more utility out of your software. Any thoughts on that?
Ashley, Roxana, anything to add? Machine learning, yes or no?
To understand whether I'm getting adoption on my product.
Yeah, or various aspects of the product
Well,
lifecycle.
I don't think you need it in
Okay.
a lot of cases. I think the standard funnels will probably work, and the value that you would invest or that the time you'll invest in doing that might not be as valuable as finding other ways of tuning your business as well. Is this your core business? is this something that will generate positive ROI? Like I'm all about doing experiments, but I'm always going to have to come back to like, is this going to help us meet our goals? How effectively is it going to meet our goals? Like, what do we expect to get out of this? And will I see indications of success quickly? Otherwise, like, we might need another thing to be done.
I want to say no if I were just like my gut intuition based on what Jared was saying too. My first answer would be no, I don't think we're there yet, but I see the potential. So I know we're approaching the end. So I'm going to end on a rhetorical potential possible next session. We always talk about personas, but really, they're done by the flaws or limited abilities of a researcher of seeing patterns within that data and also the limited data that is collected. Maybe I ask 20 questions, 30 questions, whatever it is in my interview, but there's a memory and like there's a limit to that. Whereas through an automated process, you can collect a lot more and you can uncover um, other things. So what I'm thinking is something even as simple as k-means clustering or an equivalent of it for categorical data. Can we do fully data-driven personas within super easy and supervised?
Definitely good things to look forward to as machine learning methods get better. I'm going to quickly flash something on the screen. This is a link I put in the YouTube chat, and it is in the description of the video as well. We can take a look at it later. And for this session, we collected resources and notes, and you can see them here in this recipe. So go ahead and check it out. There is this video of this conversation there. But I'm going to summarize my answer to this question, that I think this resource that I'm showing from Mixpanel does a very good job of summarizing the answer to that question, that yes, machine learning is great. It is doing a lot of interesting things, but as Ashley said, and we are hoping for it to do things like what Roxana said, but as Ashley said, deploying machine learning is expensive, complicated, and usually requires a lot of consideration. And normally in product setting, we are using machine learning either in the supervised mode to predict the user behavior. But a problem with that is that machine learning models are usually not causal. They are often not causal. Like, you have to do active work to make sure there is causality in what you're predicting, and that's often absent, which means that nothing is actionable. Like, you get something interesting, but then what? And then on the unsupervised way side of things, what you use for user segmentation, persona building, etc., usually a lot of business context exists that is not in the data. And making sure that you capture everything that is necessary is an expensive process. Is that a fundamental piece of your business or not? In most cases, the answer is no. Therefore, it's too expensive to use. This article was interesting because they said they got super excited about it at Mixpanel. They started using machine learning everywhere. They were like, let's just use heuristics. So they rolled back on using machine learning in a lot of cases. On that note, it's been an hour. So what's the call to action? What's the verdict of this session from each of you? Quick, 20-second.
I call for a part 2 with a focus on machine learning only, because we barely started scratching that surface.
True.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Definitely in for that, and definitely in to continue the conversation around what MVPs are, because I don't think we've figured it out just yet.
Yeah.
How about you, Jared?
If Mixpanel, had trouble committing to and seeing value from that, you can look at that from a glass half empty, but I look at it as a glass half full. I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity there, and I would love to dive further into it.
100%. Thank you so much, Ashley and Jared. And Roxana has always joined us today. Hope you enjoyed this conversation, and join us next week, where we will be talking about fraud detection using machine learning. And thank you so much. Hopefully this conversation was useful to you, and you take something away from it. there's a link to all the resources and notes from the session. So take a look. You can go much deeper in all of the topics we touched on. Thank you so much. See you next week.
Just a big
Thanks, everyone.
shout out to the chat because it was super duper duper active.
Right.
So hi to everyone and thank you.
Definitely.
Bye.
Are we still live? I'm scared of you.